Hey guys, welcome back to episode 3 of Whiteboard Wednesday. Last week we talked about how to determine how much income a rental property can generate, and this week we're going to dive right into determining what the monthly expenses would be for this same property. So the first thing we're going to talk about is your PITI. Your PITI is going to be your biggest expense on a rental property, and that stands for your principal, interest, taxes, and insurance. So this first line, principal and interest, I combined because that's generally your mortgage payment. So if your mortgage payment is $1,000 a month, that is comprised of your principal and interest. That $1,000 payment will be the same every month. Now the amount of that $1,000 that's going towards principal versus interest is going to vary each month. But for the purpose of determining expenses, that doesn't really matter. You just need to know how much that total payment will be. In a couple weeks, we'll talk about other ways that you make money in real estate, and one of them is loan pay down or amortization. So essentially, your tenant's rent is paying down your mortgage. As the principal goes down, you're gaining equity in the property. So it is important to know how much of that payment is going towards principal, but not necessarily for this purpose. So we'll get to that at a later date. So in order to determine how much your principal and interest will be, so obviously if you buy the house with cash, you don't have a mortgage, there won't be any, you can get rid of that line. But assuming you have a mortgage, the first thing to know is how much that mortgage is going to be. So you want to take the overall amount that you're going to offer on the house. So in this case, our starting offer would be $175,000, which was the asking price, and determine how much of that would be the mortgage. So generally an investment property has a minimum of a 20% down payment, although many banks will have 25%. For larger properties like apartment complexes, it may be 30, 35, 40% down payment. So if you recently bought a primary residence and you put 5 or 10% down, don't assume that you'll be able to do that on an investment property. That is almost always not allowed. So all of our rental properties have been 20% down payment. We really like working with local banks and local credit unions. So we have a couple that we use and work with. So when we were looking at writing this offer, we just called up the banks. We saw what their terms were at that time. And they both confirmed that they could do a 20% down payment. So once you determine the 20% down, then you can determine the remaining 80%, which would be the mortgage. The next thing you need to know is the interest rate. So again, I would just ask the bank what their current interest rate is for an investment property. Keep in mind that interest rates on investment properties are generally 0.5% to 1% higher than a primary residence. So again, if you recently bought your primary home and you paid 6.2%, you can estimate that you're probably going to be paying somewhere in the 6.7 to 7.2% for an investment property. And then the last thing you need to know is how long that mortgage is going to be. What is it amortized over? So again, the typical loan is going to be a fixed rate 30-year mortgage. So essentially you would find an online mortgage calculator. I really like mortgagecalculator.org. It's a pretty easy one to use, but the MLS has one built in, Zillow has one built in. Just Google mortgage calculator and you'll probably find one that allows you to put in all of these inputs and spit out what your principal and interest payment would be. So in this case, when we put in all of our numbers, the principal and interest combined would have been $773. Keep in mind that a lot of times when you actually make your mortgage payment, it is including your property taxes and your insurance as well. So it's not that you're paying your property taxes and your insurance when you make the mortgage payment each month, but it's that the bank is requiring you or offering that you basically set aside 1/12 of those amounts each month and put them into an escrow account. And then at the time each year that they come due, the bank pays them for you. Holly and I like doing this on our own. If you know us, we're both a little bit type A. We keep a very close tab on what our property taxes are at each property, what our insurance is, how much they're increasing each year. So we can kind of keep that finely tuned with regards to how much we're putting in our escrow. We have had the bank escrow before. We've had them do it wrong both ways. We've had them not escrow enough and we've had to bring money to the table. We've had them escrow too much and they've had to send us a check back. So we just like to be in control of that process, but the bank doesn't always let you. The next thing to determine is property taxes. So keep in mind that this is probably the thing that new investors mess up the most, is that they look on the MLS or Zillow, they see what the property taxes were last year, and they plug that number in. There's 2 reasons that this is probably not the best way to do it. One is that the property taxes are different based on if it's your primary residence or an investment property. So if you are living in the property, your taxes will be lower than if you're renting it out. And there's normally different millage rates for each of those. So you may be underestimating the taxes based on if the current owner is living there. The other thing is the property taxes generally have small increases each year, but they don't reset until the property is sold. So if the current owner bought it 30 years ago and paid $30,000, and now you're buying it for $200,000, there will likely be a pretty big increase in property taxes when the taxes reset on the sale. So if you just plug in the taxes that the current owner is paying, there's a lot of risk that could be significantly underestimated. And I've heard the other way too. I've heard of cases where someone bought a property at a great deal and the taxes went down too. Less common, but it's possible. So what I recommend is going to the county website, going to like the assessor's page, looking at what their equation is, how they determine assessed value, what the millage rates are for non-homestead, which would be you not living there. In this case, we did that. We went to the website, we plugged in all of the numbers, and it was $432 a month was what they were estimating our property taxes would be in the current year. And then the last thing is insurance. So again, call up a local insurance broker. Make sure you ask them for a rental property policy. The homeowner's policy that you have on your house is protecting the structure and everything inside your house. But for a rental property, you only need to protect the structure, and the tenant should have renter's insurance to cover the stuff. And then it also has to protect you from liability if something goes wrong on the grounds. There's also other things you can add on. So Holly and I also add on loss of rent coverage. So for example, if a tenant starts a fire and the house burns down, we have 12 months of loss of rent coverage. So the insurance company would continue to pay us the rent checks for up to 12 months until the property can be rebuilt. So things like that you can add on. Certainly things to ask about. Let them know it's a rental property policy or a landlord policy. So in our case, we had another 3-bed home nearby. The insurance was $915 a year. We assume about a 5% increase every year. So we estimated that this would be about $80 a month. So that's your PITI. Those are going to be your big expenses, but it's important to look at everything else that could also be expenses. So are you going to be responsible for any utilities? Generally, for a single family home, you can have the tenant be responsible for all of the utilities because they're the only ones using the property. But some states or areas have requirements, like for example, the owner is required to pay water and sewer, or they're required to pay garbage and recycling, things like that. So make sure you know the rules in your area, what you can charge back to the tenant. And then also if you have a duplex, triplex, something like that, make sure you know if the utilities are sub-metered for each unit. So if there's only one electrical box for 2 units of a duplex, you can't charge that to the tenants and just split it in half, because one tenant might run the AC all summer long and the other tenant's trying to save money. And it's not fair to make them split that bill. And actually in most places it would be illegal for you to do that. So make sure you know the laws in your area about what utilities you're responsible for and how you can split them. And if there's more than one unit, make sure the unit is sub-metered. For example, water is typically not sub-metered. So that would be something in a multi-unit property that the landlord would be responsible for paying. So in this single family home, the utilities would have been zero because we can put everything back on the tenant, and the garbage and recycling are part of the property taxes. The next thing is lawn and snow. Are you going to make the tenant responsible for cutting the grass and shoveling? That's something you could include in your lease. Or do you want to do it so you make sure it gets done and you don't get fined? Our city is quick to fine you if the grass gets too long or if there's too many dandelions, things like that. So you can decide if you want the tenant to do that or if you're going to do it. If you're going to do it, decide if you're going to do it yourself or if you're going to pay for it, and you'll need to account for that in your numbers. Again, if you have a 4-unit property, you probably can't ask the tenants to do that themselves because who's responsible for it? That would be then the responsibility of the owner. So in this case, we do ask our tenants to do it, and if they don't want to do it, we offer them the name of the service that we use and they can set up the service themselves. Or again, we can set that up for a small charge. Are you going to have a property management company? So if you're going to do property management, you certainly have to account for that in your numbers. We account for it in our numbers even if we don't, because who knows what's going to happen in life? Who knows if you have to move unexpectedly or you get a new job and you can't handle it anymore, it's just too much, or if someone gets sick or something like that. We always want to make sure that our cash flow isn't so tight that if we had to hire a property manager, it would go negative. So we run our numbers. In this case, we would not be getting a property manager, so I'm going to put 0, but we would rerun our numbers at the end with, for example, an 8 or a 10% management fee. So that would be, for example, 10% of the monthly rent or $180 a month, and make sure that we would still be cash flow positive so that if we needed to plug in a property manager, we would still make money. Generally, if a property manager is about 8% of your rent, we know at some point we likely will hire a property manager, but rents tend to go up by about 3% per year. So as long as we can hold out about 3 years, we could hire a property manager at the same cash flow that we have today. HOA. So is it in a homeowners association? We personally try to avoid HOAs for investing. They can change the rules at any time. They can make it so that you can't rent anymore. There's also a lot of special assessments, so those are hard to account for in your numbers. So if you are going to invest in an HOA, just do your due diligence. Make sure you know the things that are associated with that, the things that they can charge you for, how they would go about changing the rules. So just be smart if you're in an HOA. And then the last thing I have here is business expenses. So if you're like us and you're managing it yourself, you likely have expenses associated with that. Maybe you have a business phone line, a PO box. Maybe you have property management software and bookkeeping software and things like that that you're using to run your business. So you do want to make sure you're accounting for that in your expenses because those are things you're having to pay for each month. The hard thing is those tend to be fixed expenses. If you go from 1 property to 10, you don't have to pay more for your property management software generally, or for your bookkeeping software, things like that. So if you have 1 property that's cash flowing $400 a month and your business expenses are $200, it's taking half of your cash flow. But if you then scale your portfolio to 10 properties, maybe your expenses only go up from $200 to $300. Well, now that $300 is spread across 10 properties, you're only paying $30 per property. So I don't like to account for this when I'm analyzing an individual deal because it can throw your numbers off. But you do want to make sure that your cash flow is enough to also cover the business expenses associated with running it. If there's any expenses associated individually with this property, I would include that here. And then the last thing is other. So is there anything else that I missed here? Anyone who's investing in real estate, do you have other expenses that you account for? Or do you have expenses that you've forgotten about? So you underwrite a deal, you determine how much you think it's going to be, and then another expense pops up, or you calculated something incorrectly. And it can happen either way, for good or for bad, but it can throw off your numbers. So it's important to do this as accurately as possible. So I believe this adds up, if I'm not mistaken, to $1,285, which means that your income is going to be $540 more than your expenses for this property. So seems pretty good right now, right? The only thing is we didn't account for here any maintenance or repairs of anything that breaks or any capital expenditures like a roof, a furnace, a hot water heater. So those are things that you can't nicely predict for because they don't come up every month. So we account for them as reserves. And next week, I'll talk about how we calculate reserves, how that plays into this equation. And ultimately, once you have reserves along with income and expenses, how you can determine what your cash flow is. The following week, we'll talk about how much cash flow is good and how to kind of analyze cash flow between properties. So we hope you come back the next couple weeks to finish up how to analyze or underwrite a deal. Again, please comment, make sure you like and subscribe if you want to know when these come out, and we look forward to seeing you next week on Whiteboard Wednesday.